And welcome back to Frankly Speaking. I'm your host, Frank. Okay, guys. Tonight I need your help with something. And if I'm off base here, please let me know in the comment section. Tell me what I'm missing. And the fundamental question I'm trying to answer tonight is what did we in the West, the Western liberal republics, what did we win after World War II? Were we the winners? And what was the great victory over? What were the benefits of the end results of World War II? Because this is sort of the liberal cliche we've always been given, right? That World War II was America and the Allied powers going to war to stand up to tyrannical fascist regime, and we went in there to liberate Europe. And after the war, not only did we liberate, but we sacrificed all these boys, and we went in there with the money and the Marshall Plan to rebuild Europe. That's how kind we were. And the only thing we asked for in return from the Europeans was a little plot of land to bury our dead, right? That's kind of sort of the cliche liberal narrative we've been given, which justifies the liberal world order that arose after World War II. As we've seen, and as I'll cover here over the next few minutes, everything that we've really gone through in the West and how civilization has radically changed. Now, again, I was watching this interesting debate on the Joe Rogan show between Doug Smith and this neocon guy, Douglas Murray, where this topic came up. Douglas Murray is a sort of a right-wing neocon that doesn't like all the alternative sort of influences that are coming online that are challenging your liberal narrative, right? The liberal world order narrative. He's pro-Ukraine war. He's pro-Israel. And invariably, we always get into World War II because the World War II narrative is starting to be questioned by a lot of people, especially now that we're in a post, not only liberal society where everything looks to be degenerating, but even more so, we have more information at our hands. And people are starting to question some of the things that we've been taught. Bear in mind, before the internet age, we were all limited on our knowledge of many historical events. And World War II was one of them. When I was growing up, when I was a kid, any historical research, and this even goes back to my days in college, actually, any historical research we did, again, we were limited because of the sort of lack of advancement of the internet when I was going to college, and we would have to go to the library and pick up books and source everything. But the interesting thing is that, we now see what sort of, again, a world that's dominated by liberals has all the institutions have been hijacked, ironically enough, after World War II, how it limits us not only in our ability to get information, but perspective. And so in my days, we used to go to the library to do a report when we studied history, let's say like a historical figure like, Benito Mussolini or Adolf Hitler, right? We would go to the library. There would be a select sort of, amount of books that were there that were always picked out by the liberal librarians, right? We were given a select choice of how our perspective, our knowledge, and our intuition was built by, again, these very liberal institutions. There wasn't options to go on the internet and say, wait a minute, this person challenges this person challenges that. I never in college did I hear of a historian by the name of David Irving who challenged the status quo from the liberal world order when it comes to the World War II narrative. No, our liberal librarians, most of which are far leftists, gave us a select choice and perspective on how we were to view history. But now we live in the day of the internet, where everything is pretty much open now, where we have more access to information. And this is the problem that the liberal new world order has. And that's why a guy like Douglas Murray was sent out into this debate and to kind of protect the neocon establishment liberal world order and to set everything sort of back to normal from this liberal perspective. And so it was interesting. But in the midst of this discussion, listen, Dave Smith, I don't really know him other than He's been on Candace Owens shows a couple of times, but they were discussing many things. The big one they were discussing Israel and that war in Israel and all that stuff. But the one that came up again was the World War II narrative. And the World War II narrative that's being challenged more and more. This, of course, upset the neocon liberal Douglas Murray, that basically says, hey, listen, you guys, hey, Joe Rogan, you're bringing on all these pseudo historians to, again, distort history. Why do you do that? He really challenged Joe Rogan and his integrity. And Joe Rogan, to his credit, said, listen, I bring on everybody. I get all the perspectives. See, because at the end of the day, whether they're liberals of the left or liberals of the right, they try to control the information. While the left outright bans a sort of free speech and information, the right has selective speech. Both sides of the aisle actually restrict the information that we can get so we can have proper, nuanced sort of arguments and perspectives. But we got a little bit into, or at least this debate, into the World War II narrative, and how both Dave Smith and Douglas Murray agree that the world under a Nazi win in World War II, if that would have happened, would have been far worse than the world we have today, right? We went into Europe and we liberated from tyranny, from this tyrannical Nazi regime. And again, we won today and we saved the world from this great evil. I've always found that kind of an interesting perspective, because you look at the world today, and I talk to more and more people, more and more historians actually, that are saying, listen, how is it that we won World War II, but yet it doesn't feel like we won? Because the world in many ways has gone mad since the end of World War II. Something has changed culturally, politically, religiously, familially. Something has gone radically wrong in the West. And most people can't pinpoint what this is. And so then we begin to make a bunch of political compromises. We accept the new moral and social norms, and we try and govern what we have, because the next election is the most important election of our lifetime. If we lose that, all hell is going to break loose. But yeah, okay. But all hell has broken loose already in the West. And it's happened since World War II. Now, let's think about this for a second. Okay, let's think about this for a second. And listen, guys, if I'm off, let me know where I'm off. Let me know where my thinking is wrong here. Leave it in the comments section. And because of my series that I've done on this channel with Mussolini, the deep dive that I do, I'm no Nazi apologist. I'm not a fan of the Nazi regime. I know I got a bunch of white boys telling me that the Nazi regime, they were effectively Christian crusaders. Listen, I'm not an expert on Nazi Germany. I've read a lot about them, because invariably when you dive deep into Italian history, you're going to get into that period of history where you have to, deal with this alliance between the Italians and the Germans, one that I've always argued was more out of political convenience rather than ideological. But that's for another time. And so when you get to the Nazis, here's the thing about the Nazis, okay? As many evil things as they did in war and in battle, and they did treat the Polish very harshly, and even more so, they treated the Italians very harshly after the king turned on them. We could have a discussion about how battle should be conducted in the midst of war, and how you deal with certain territories that might have turned on you, or how to try and gain control of certain territories in the midst of possibly open revolutions that may sort of take over or undermine your military. I get that, right? There's military strategies, but it's difficult for me reading sort of the history of World War II, particularly what is called the Italian Civil War between 1943 and 45, not to notice the brutality of the Nazis and what they did to the Italians. To such a degree, even Pope Pius XII had to protest this. And I know there's a lot of pro-Nazi white boys out there saying that, the Nazis were in conjunction with the Vatican. Listen, man, I'm not buying that. There's too much. I think, again, that's a nuanced relationship based upon geographical territory and certain assumptions that were made earlier in sort of the time span of that period of history. But there came a point where even the church realized the Nazis were pretty brutal. Now, that being said, were the Nazis worse than the Soviet Union? Were they worse than Uncle Joe, the great allies of the Americans and the British? Because comparatively speaking, this is what we're talking about, the aftermath of World War II. We're talking about an Allied victory because the general understanding of history after the Allies defeated the Axis powers is that, yeah, the Allies won, and then the globe was actually split in half, half to the Anglo-Protestant West, and the other half was taken over by the Soviet communists. But here's my question. Did the communists take over half the globe, or did the communists take over the entire globe? Because communism spread like wildfire throughout the entire globe. It spread into Italy right away. I mean, listen, I had Patrick Peters, the author of the book Botch Victory, on this podcast talk about how Togliatti, a straight a Stalinist, was so influential in Italy, undermining Catholic civilization, Catholic culture. Antonio Gramsci, an Italian communist, has had a great influence in this cultural hegemony, Marxist hegemony thing that has encompassed the world. Communism spread all over the place. It spread into Italy. It spread into Germany. It spread into Spain. It spread into Portugal. It spread into all of Western Europe. Eventually, it would consume the Anglo-Protestant nations like England, America, Canada. It went into South America. It went out east into China. It went all over the world. Communism did. Communism, an ideology, unlike the Nazis, that before the war were claiming they wanted a worldwide revolution. You see, the communists were internationalists. The Nazis were not. The Nazis were dealing and how fascism rises. And again, I distinguish between Italian fascism and Nazism. I see them as distinctly different. As I said before, fascism has only really existed in one country in the history of the world, and that was Italy. It was the ideology that was built by Benito Mussolini and Giovanni Gentili, and really it was an Italian thing. We use fascism in different terms later on in order to sort of categorize a lot of these nations that kind of fought together on the Axis powers because they were trying to protect, again, their Catholic sort of nations from the infiltration of liberalism and Marxism. So everybody gets called fascism. I guess you got fascism with a capital F that only existed in Italy. And then I guess you have fascism with a little f, where we call everybody a fascist, sort of as a boogeyman word. But the fascists, whether, if you want to call it that, whether it was Italians or whether it was the Spanish or whether it was the Austrians or whether it was the Portuguese or whether it was the Germans, these were not the guys looking for a worldwide revolution. It was the Soviet Union. It was the communists. It was the Marxists that were proclaiming a worldwide revolution. That's what they wanted. And fascism rises as a response to communism. That's why fascism was born. That's what the Italians were dealing with. It's what the Germans were dealing with. In Germany, they were dealing with infiltration. They were dealing with the invasion of Bolsheviks in all these nations. And so, again, that's why I find this thing strange because, I know there's going to be some historians out there that claim that Mustache Man wanted to conquer the entire world. Well, listen, I got to see that. I need hard evidence for that. Because I don't think Hitler might have been arrogant, and we know this to a certain degree because he did go after the Soviet Union. All the while, Mussolini kept telling him, "Don't do it, don't do it, don't make the same mistake as Napoleon." But to suggest that Mustache Man was that arrogant, I need hard, concrete evidence. Okay, and I know many classical liberals, historians, are going to make that argument because they have to make that argument. Because if you align yourself with international Marxists who have a publicly proclaimed idea of a worldwide revolution and you side with the revolutionaries, you got a problem if you're the classical liberals. So this is why, again, history has been distorted, or at least I believe history has been distorted to make the Nazis out to be something that I'm not sure that they were. Again, the Nazis were not innocent. Nazis were not good guys from everything I understand. But at the same time, we have to be fair in judging history. It was the communists that were proclaiming a worldwide revolution. So this idea of conquering the world, gosh, man, I don't see it. I got to see some hardcore evidence with that. The fact is that the Western liberal republics decided to align with Uncle Joe. That was the mistake that was made. In the case of the British, um, they had this foreign policy that, in my opinion, from my understanding, but reading different historians, they started both world wars because of a foreign policy to always keep a particular military balance within Europe that was a threat to their global empire. Whenever somebody would rise in Europe, the British always made sure they aligned with the weaker powers to keep the stronger power that was a threat to their colonial empire in check. And that's what the Germans represented in World War One and World War Two. And this is why these historians would argue that the British started both world wars. And so, for the British, they fell into this trap. And for the Americans, in many ways, an administration in FDR that was kooky far left, that was infiltrated with communist spies within it, at least two within the upper brass. Henry Morgenthau, who concocted the Morgenthau Plan after World War II with the plan to exterminate the German race. His sort of undersecretary, Harry Dexter White, was known to be a Soviet spy, according to the Venona cables, right, that were deciphered. And you just had a far left presidential administration. Listen, pretty much after the Civil War, we get into the progressive era in America. America is a radical left-wing nation. Granted, it's before mass media, mass transit, or at least it's starting to develop at the turn of the century. But let's not kid ourselves. America went far left after the Civil War. And we see this in the Woodrow Wilson administration. We see this in the FDR administration. And in many ways, we've had one radical sort of presidency and sort of American government that's been radically left. And the FDR administration was exactly that. And aligning with Uncle Joe was a very interesting decision, to say the least. When in many ways, the fascist nations actually had values that were closer to the American people in a much more conservative nation than the American government itself at the time. That's the fascinating thing about this. And so we're told that, yeah, we won World War II. Well, let's talk about that for a second. What did we actually win? Let's start with the British. It is said that Winston Churchill, great leader, that saved England from sort of this tyrannical Nazi regime. Okay. Well, the first of which, there is historical data out there. Again, I'm not an expert on this, but from what I've read, and I'll let the expert historians comment on this, Hitler never had a problem with the British. Hitler tried to cut deals with the British. And some will say, oh, you can't trust the Nazis, but it was the British that also broke the alliances. The question is, could you trust the British? Because the relationship that I know of very well, this relationship between the British and the Italians and Mussolini, it was the British that kept breaking their deals with the Italians. It was the British that were hostile toward the Italians when Mussolini always wanted to be on the British side. So when I'm told that the Nazis can't be trusted in these negotiations between the British and the Germans, I kind of have a curious attitude about that, because I know that the talks and the racism that a particular foreign defense minister or foreign minister, what's his name? I forget his name now, didn't like Mussolini and did everything possible in order to break up this relationship and drive Mussolini into Hitler's camp. Again, Mussolini doesn't join the Axis powers because of an ideological reason per se. He joins because he's driven there by the Allied powers, who simply don't like fascism and don't like Mussolini personally. This is why I'm not buying this idea that, okay, you can't trust the Nazis because of this cartoon caricature that has been developed throughout history. I'm not saying Hitler was completely honest, but the British weren't either. That's my point. Okay, so but Churchill saves England from this impediment, this disaster of World War II, and what has happened to England since World War II. The first of which is that Churchill lost the empire. He lost the complete colonial empire. You say, well, yeah, they fought a war. It happens. Okay, yeah, but he lost it. And in the process, England became America's bitch and more dependent on America than ever before for its defense, its resource, everything, and it became a subject of America. In the process of that, after World War II, England goes through some radical liberalization, including a shift to the socialist left, where government took more and more control, where Labour Party had long periods of dominance in British politics and culture and society, to such a degree that the British become one of the most liberal nations on the face of the planet. Economically, it goes full-blown socialist, control of the economy, manipulation of the economy against average everyday people. And then on top of it all, as the faith collapses during that same time span, the Church of England becomes irrelevant. It liberalized that part of the world. Now we have a mass migration movement in England that is actually overtaking and conquering your English heritage. They elect a Muslim mayor. The indigenous English people are being forced out of the cities into the countryside as a nation is being fundamentally transformed by weaponized migration that nobody has the willingness to stop anymore. Part of it is the shame and blame, the history of sort of the colonial empire that they can't get over. But that's also a byproduct of liberalism. That same liberalism that became dominant after World War II, as dictated by, again, the communist regime over in the Soviet Union. England is a shadow of itself. You say, well, Churchill saved England. What did they save? England doesn't look like England anymore. England is gone. It's morally debased. It's ashamed of its history, and now it's been conquered by third world nations. Let's move to America. America, barely what, 10, 15 years after the war is over, begins to go through a massive radicalization of the culture, massive control of the economy into the hands of a few oligarchs. Just 15 years after the war, call it 15, 16 years, we start to go through a sexual revolution. And it begins with the pill being made over the counter in 1961, which means if the legislation and is ultimately approved by the Supreme Court, it means that that sexualization, that cultural movement is already happening underground or even above the surface at that point in the 1950s. In other words, America wins World War II, but the culture is already being radically transformed by that victory because of the spread of global communism all over the world. And with that comes the radicalization of the culture, starting with women, right? The pill is made over the counter in 1961, altering the nature and relationship of men and women going into the workforce, women dressing like men, women getting into politics, women getting into the civil discourse, women leaving their duties of being the home caretakers, their responsibility of children. Women begin to self-sterilize themselves. Women begin to abort their children. Women begin to sort of surrender their godly, orderly, sort of natural ability to control the sort of the sexual nature of man, right? Because a woman can say no to sex. She has a control of that ability. Men don't. And as a process of this all, women become much more promiscuous in the West. In America, it's easy, obviously, as we see a shack up culture form. We see the out of birth wedlock sort of explode after the 1960s. We see the Murphy Browns. We don't need men anymore. We see angry feminist women that are screeching and breaking up marriages. We have a situation now that women initiate 75% of all divorces, 90% if they're college educated. Women begin to flood the universities, begin to take jobs of men, jobs that are historically males. And of course, this throws men off into a world where effectively they're not needed in large part. But of course, that comes at a detriment to society. We have now a culture and society of screeching young women that, again, are not having children. They're not staying married, and ultimately, they've destroyed the culture in various ways. We have a divorce culture. We have a contraception culture. We have an abortion culture. Just think about all the abortions we've had. This is what's happened after World War II. In America alone, we've had at least 60 million abortions. I just don't have stats for all the other Western nations. But this kind of genocide, and it is a genocide, this idea that women would begin to murder their own children, and I don't care who gets offended by that, because the right is already surrendering the abortion issue because of the sensitivities of how we're not supposed to say that anymore. I don't care. Women are killing their children, and I don't care how that affects the polls. I don't care what the next election really results of people saying that. The fact is, women went batshit crazy after the 1960s as a byproduct of the liberal world order created by World War II and the outcome of that war. Women are murdering their children. Women are self-sterilizing. Women are initiating divorces. Women are breaking up marriages. Women are altering our course. And in the process of all this is women that have become much more promiscuous than men. And in the process of this all, women are broken. Why? Because when women have multiple sexual partners, they can't form pair bonds anymore. This is why it's women that are miserable in the society. It's why women are the ones that are screeching and complaining every 5 seconds. It's why we have to cater to them in these facade of elections that we have throughout the West, and why we're always talking about the reproductive issues and how they demand their rights and they demand this and they demand that to appease this sort of reproductive issue that they took on for themselves because they rejected men when men used to protect them, men used to provide for them. And in some ways, I get it. We live in this sort of material dialectic world where when materialism is your highest end goal, why wouldn't women want to participate? I get it. Children get in the way of this liberal world, right? Where we're all going to make the money and buy cheap consumer goods to make us happy. And yet none of us are really happy. Women have lost their minds in post-World War II society. And I know this because I knew women. My family came from that old world. I knew women of the old world where before liberalism hit. They were pious, they were holy, they were virtuous, they went to church, they served and understood their natural role. We've had a radicalization of the genders in society, especially with women. This is, again, all a post-World War II phenomenon. Now, let's head on over to the men. Men have been emasculated. Men have lost their place as providers. Men have lost their place and purpose as protectors of the families. Men aren't getting married anymore. Men can't afford houses. Men can't are not having children. Men are opting out of marriage because there's nothing to gain from marriage because women have all the power and the control in this post-liberal feminist society where women have just demanded all these rights through the legislative process. And effectively, men have opted out, and men are watching porn, and men are watching OnlyFans. That's how they're dealing with their sexual nature now at this point. Men are nowhere to be found anymore. Men have become weak because men have been emasculated by this liberal feminist society. None of this is good. And what has been the end result of this post-Western world, this post-liberal world after World War II? Well, the primary issue is, of course, the broken family, right? And the broken family can come in a lot of different ways, right? It's the shack up culture. It's the kids being born out of wedlock, homes without fathers. Oftentimes, not a mother and a father. We see that in the Black community. I saw when I was growing up, where oftentimes there wasn't even a parent in the home. It was grandparents raising those children. We have the Murphy Browns of the world. We remember that in the early 90s, where you don't need a man to raise a child. A single mom can raise a child. We've experimented socially, and yet we go through this sort of 90s sort of counterculture revolution where you have all these kids that come from divorce homes screeching through music how their life was ruined because their parents got divorced, right? We got a divorce culture. Women are just walking out, robbing men of everything they've ever earned, their money, their property. They take their children away. Marriage has become a risk because guess what? Women have dictated the terms through feminism, right? It's not a anymore an institution where you're in it together for a lifetime. We've given people the option. See, that's what's interesting. When you go back to the post-war era in Italy, Togliatti, not only was he a communist, he was a Stalinist. He cut a deal during the formation of the Italian Constitution after World War II. He said, you know what, the Lateran Accords, that little deal that Mussolini cut with the church to give him Vatican City and to make the Catholic Church the integralist sort of religion of the nation. You know what? You could have that. You could have that, guys. We could keep that in the Constitution. You know what? I got a better way to take out the church. First of all, it's a country that's 98% Catholic. I don't want to deal with that right now. But you know what? I'll tell you what, you guys got the line of course. Just give me marriage. Let's just make sure you keep the line of courts, but let's remove from the Italian Constitution what the fascist regime installed was the indissolubility of marriage. That's what Togliatti wanted, and that's what Togliatti got. The moment marriage is now dissolvable in Italy, the cultural Marxists, and the Stalins too, for that matter, they got you. They got you. They're coming after the family. And the first, of course, is the issue of divorce. Because when a divorce happens, that is the destruction of the family. And with the destruction of a family comes the destruction of the culture. America, de facto speaking, because it's a Protestant nation and Protestants have all this weird subjective morality, we've seen divorces explode since the 1960s. Half of all divorces, or all marriages, I should say, end in divorces. I mean, that's a rough stat. People define those things differently, but the point is still the same. There's a lot of divorces because we don't look at marriage as something permanent. Because anytime a woman gets a weird kind of a feeling, her emotions tell her she doesn't want this anymore, she could file for divorce and leave anytime she wants. Because everything favors the woman at the end of the day, and women are governed by emotions. And usually it's men that are left holding the bag, I guess you could say. Again, women initiate 75 to 80% of all divorces, 90% if they're college educated, right? Well, let's move on to education. Now we got these liberal universities, all filled with communists, by the way. And then we get this strange thing in, again, I'll speak for American society, but I'm pretty sure it's pretty standard across all of the West. We got this thing where we begin to push education in institutions that are dominated by liberals and ultimately communists and Marxists. And then Americans, even conservative Americans, sort of accept this rite of passage, all in the name of freedom, that our kids need to go to the liberal universities to experience sex, drugs, and rock and roll, a rite of passage. All the while, the right is teaching us through talk radio that we need to pull ourselves up by a bootstrap. We're Americans. We work hard, right? We don't go to the government because that's stealing from your neighbor. You once you turn 18, you got to get out there and create economic prosperity and work hard and achieve all this economic and material success. And that's what makes you a great American. And in that process, of course, once you turn the legal age of 18, you're out into the real world. You shame anybody who's 18 is still living with their parents. It's not a good thing because you need economic activity. But in that process, we throw these young people out into a world, a godless world, full of secular liberalism, with all of its deceptions, all of its sins, all of its allures, all of its, all the problems that we get from sex and pornography and alcohol and drugs. Everything is designed to deceive the youth. And then this strange thing starts in America, sometimes in the 60s and 70s, where we got to go through this rite of passage. where all of our 18 and 19-year-olds go to college, they go away from home, where there's no protective measures of the family. And everybody knows this is where you go find yourself, right? Sex, drugs, rock and roll, all the while you're being liberalized by some communist professor. And the horror stories begin to come out, right? Of young ladies now whose body counts are climbing because women now are more promiscuous than men because they're trying to act like men. They're reacting to the nature of the pill that alters their chemistry. It alters their mindset. It alters, how they determine what proper partners are, how they choose partners, right? There's a whole psychology and biological nature to women that are on the pill versus women that are on the pill. And women start making a lot of poor choices because of the chemical imbalance that the pill causes at the end of the day. And of course, we're not allowed to talk about these because this makes us kooks. And this, of course, makes anybody who challenges this notion, especially Catholics, who've held firm to the idea that artificial contraception or any kind of contraception is problematic. And all of a sudden now we have young ladies and men for that part that are participating in a society full of sexual license. And with that comes what? More pills, more abortions, broken relationships, kids out of wedlock, and the absolute collapse of the culture through the collapse of the family, because families now are not being well formed based upon the faith, the sacramental nature of our Christian heritage through our ancestral roots. No, we have a new liberal society. A liberal society says, no, 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 we're going to do it this way, apart from Christianity, because Christianity is really a choice. It's an option. We have freedom here. And so if you don't want to do it like your parents, plus your parents or your grandparents, they were fuddy-duddies, right? Come on, come on. We live in a new age now with great technology and great medical advancement. We can have fun and still pursue our careers. And yet here we are with a bunch of universities that have now indoctrinated 2 and 3 and 4 generations of offspring only to destroy them socially. And now we have just a rampant curse of broken families all over the place. Right? This is what liberalism brought after the world. And these are all things that were not as prevalent in European, at least the Catholic nations, right? You want to go places like France that liberalized after the French Revolution, fine. But in those Catholic nations, Italy, France, Portugal, Spain, Austria, they were still trying to push back against the French Revolution and a lot of these liberal ideas. America being a liberal nation, hence being a confused, relative Protestant nation, it was only a matter of time till American society fell to the deceptions of liberalism. And look what's happened. Look what's happened to the culture. Look what's happened to the family. It's all collapsed since the end of World War II. It doesn't even make sense anymore. You go to the beach now, and the girls are walking with flossy string up their butt. And it's normal now. They're literally naked. Listen, I heard a stat the other day. I don't know if it's true or not, but Gen Z, 10% of Gen Z girls are now doing OnlyFans. Okay? That means 10% of the Gen Zers, of the young ladies of Gen Z, are proverbial online prostitutes. That's how far our culture has fallen. This has been the end result of liberalism. A liberalism that we said won after World War II, and that was a good thing. Yeah, no, the West has fallen. So let's move on. In that same process, in that same thinking, right? The ideas, remember, of freedom and liberty, that's what we're taught as Americans. We have freedom and liberty, and yet we've been thrown into a usury system where people have been made into proverbial work slaves, right? We don't own any property anymore. We're in perpetual debt. The manipulation of money and the printing of money has inflated the cost of everything. Houses are now not only are they ornamental in the sense that either you can't be self-sufficient because of the size, structure, HOAs, the way we deal with homes, or the fact that everybody's thrown into, if not an ornamental home, a condominium, they're not designed to really make us self-sufficient. Even though the classic rule say you got to pull yourself up by your bootstrap. You can't pull yourself up by your bootstrap if your society is not structured to be able to be self-sufficient. Most homes that are created, again, are ornamental homes. There's no land because the bankers and the oligarchs have monopolized all the land, right? They've even taken over all the farms. And so we have a strange housing scenario where nobody has any land anymore, right? And when we do buy a home, which is basically something to rest your head on, so you get up in the morning, go back to the usury system, a corporate usury system, you never get out of this perpetual debt. Most people won't. This is why we continue to have this disparity between the upper classes, the middle class, and the poor. That disparity gets wider and wider and wider. The wealth keeps going higher and higher to the top, and there's less at the bottom. Healthcare is out of control. Food prices now are out of control. Housing, insurances are out of control. Everything has been inflated on the lower and middle classes, and they're being crushed. And everybody feels it, and nobody sees an answer. That combined again with a usury banking system that has monopolized the land. And for some strange reason, bankers believe that the land belongs to them because they've been able to manipulate money, when in fact, the land wasn't created by the bankers. The land was created by God, given to every family so they could use the splendid resources in order to raise our families. We talk about dying populations. That's another great tragedy of the West that nobody really addresses. But of course, we're going to have dying populations. And there's many reasons why that's happening, right? The sexual revolution, the narcissism of liberalism, but even more so, if you don't have land, how can you raise a family? How can you provide for a family? You can't. This is one of the great disasters of the West, the great disasters of liberalism. They robbed us. They kicked us off the land into the hands of the oligarch when the land always belonged, was a gift by God for us to raise our families. You wonder why we have dying populations all over the West? You know, Americans used to make fun of the Italians because the Italians has such a low sort of fertility rate. We're matching them now. America's fertility rates are collapsing, and I would argue when they were a little bit higher, it's most likely Hispanics and a few Mormons in Utah that were providing children. It's not like the Americans are any different than the liberal Europeans now. Maybe the French Revolution hit a little closer in Europe. It didn't take long to get here. America's always been 10, 20 years behind, but we're catching up now with modern technology and modern communications. The land has been robbed. Nobody can own a home. Nobody can even buy a home. They're too darn expensive. And then we have, right, people fleeing what is supposedly the greatest country in the history of the world to move to Mexico and Thailand and the Philippines because they're escaping a usury system that has pinned everybody down to perpetual debt. People are tired of it and they're escaping the greatest country in the history of the world. Kind of a strange kind of thing to say, when in fact, people have been made proverbial slaves to this usury system, guys. I mean, there's real issues here. There's real issues here, you know? So then we get to our food supplies, right? Food supplies, where the oligarchs have monopolized all the grocery stores, right? We used to have local bakers. We used to have local butchers. We had all this stuff, and now all of a sudden, the big corporations, the oligarchs, under the name of freedom and liberty, have bought up all the land. They control all the farms. Our food is not local anymore. Basically the local markets have all been wiped out for the most part. Sure, you may have a little market here and there in some town, but for the most part, we're all going to these mass oligarchical sort of, food stores now that provide all our foods. They're shipped in from hundreds of miles away. Only God knows what they put into these foods. And then we wonder why the cancer rates are higher and higher and higher, and why we're dying younger, and why Americans are so damn fat. Where, if you go to parts of Europe, like Sicily and Sardinia, for example, those people over there in the blue zones, they live forever. Because while the oligarchs have tried to get in there, those people still go to the local markets, right? You still got the small farmers. You still got the fishermen with the little boats like my grandfather had. They're eating natural, organic foods over there. They're not being shipped in by some oligarchs. They found a way around that system, and those people live forever. I mean, the blue zone in Sicily and Sardinia, I mean, a lot of them live to their 90s to hundreds. And here, we're sicker, we're fatter, and we got all kinds of medical problems. And of course, we have a medical industry that's more how should I say, motivated by dealing, or should I say monitoring sickness rather than curing sickness. The health industry is completely corrupt. That's the other issue here, right? We talk about the tyranny of the old world, the tyranny of the monarchs, as many conservatives taught me when I was in conservative camp. And yet, remember, we had a certain medical issue a few years back, about 4 years ago. And then there was a solution by the people that gave us the medical issue that apparently is not very healthy. Well, guess what? Name me the fascist regime that pulled that stunt on its own people. Name me the monarch that pulled that stunt on its own people. Don't tell me about tyranny. Don't tell me about freedom and liberty when you looked in the mirror of a liberal society, a godless liberal society that looks at its own people with, with contempt, guys. I don't want to hear about that anymore. And this is, again, all post World War II liberalism. I can continue on to lay out the case how the West has gone mad. And it's not that the West is falling, it's fallen. This is not to mention the collapse of the faith, the collapse of Christianity, right? The degenerate nature of Protestantism that contributes to the moral collapse of societies, particularly America, the Catholic Church and the infiltration and its struggles over there. Again, the mass migration to bring in pluralism, again, another value of liberalism, when in fact it destroys ethnic origins and it brings all kinds of conformity issues and disunity. I mean, look at America today. Have we ever been more divided? The stupid notion that I hear every Thanksgiving that makes no sense to me, right? We got to dread this, yearly Thanksgiving thing where we got to go to the Thanksgiving table and argue with relatives over politics. That's silly. It's absolutely silly. Because in the old world, you had a political class. They did what they did, and our opinions didn't matter. And yes, I know that offends many liberal sensibilities, many Americans. Hey, my vote matters. My opinion matters for something. And yet that world was more healthy than the world we have today, where we've gone mad, where even though we all have an opinion, the bad guys always seem to win. The bad guys always seem to be in power. And when we elect a supposed good guy, he never does the right thing. And the trajectory of the West, the trajectory of these liberal governments always goes to the far left. You look at America post-World War II. Can you say it's a free nation? We love the mythos of freedom, right? We love the mythos of the founding. But do you really feel free? Or does this look like some kind of a Marxist mashup that we have now? You see? That's the interesting thing about this. I'm just looking at the West for what it is. The politics is corrupt. The culture is rotten. The family has been destroyed. And even within the realm of the individual, right? We champion individual rights. The individual has gone mad. We now cope with this liberal world through mass drugs, depression drugs, alcohol, illegal drugs, because people are so unhappy. They're so broken in liberal society. And I think a lot of it has to do with the lack of faith, with the lack of family or the broken family. People are dealing with all these disorders in their life, right? The sexual revolution that causes havoc, especially in young ladies that, again, have become very promiscuous and have destroyed their lives, have destroyed their biological function and the ability to pair bond with men. They're not happy. Nobody's happy. People are miserable. The blended families, which, listen, that happened in the old world, but in the liberal world, it's exploded because of all the broken families. And then you're trying to mend all these broken relationships. And that only leads to bigger problems. We have great portions of American civilization. Go to the inner cities. Look at the Black community. Look at the Hispanic community. They're just broken cultures, and to such a degree that many people are acknowledging it's not fixable. The inner cities are not fixable. The cities are out of control. The cities are proverbial anarchy, the proverbial war zones. That really didn't happen in the old world. Yeah, you had liberalism crept in after the French Revolution, but because we had cultural and ethnic hegemony, there's always a reason how those people could come together and fix some of these problems. We can't. We can't, because we're a godless nation. We've embraced liberalism and all of its faults, all of its dysfunctions. And now we have a nation that's completely divided. Americans at each other's throats. We don't even look at ourselves as fellow citizens, as paisans, right? As fellow Catholics, as fellow townspeople, right? As we used to do in the old world. No, 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 no. We look at each other like liberals and conservatives. You see how that thing of liberal politics has become a religion, and Americans look at each other like enemies. Why? Because liberalism says we don't need to share common values. We don't need common religion. We don't need common culture. We don't need common ethnicity. All we have is freedom and liberty. Kiss my ass. You can't tell me what to do. Well, that's the nature, or should I say, the rebellious nature of liberalism. A rebellious nature that it's been existing in America since its founding. Listen, listen. Communism and the infiltration of communism after World War II did its damage to America and the entire West. But ultimately, communism is a byproduct of liberalism. It originates with Locke and a lot of the Enlightenment thinkers that gets us to Marx by the mid 1800s. It was all going to collapse anyways because you cannot have a society without cultural and religious hegemony. You cannot have a proper functioning society without the moral law in place. And when you create liberal societies that say, listen, morality is subjective, religion is subjective, our ancestral or our DNA or our culture, everything is relative in society in the name of freedom and liberty. It was always bound to collapse at the end of the day. And you look at the West today, and people say, well, the West has fallen. No, the West has fallen. Why? Because the fumes of the old Christian world, what we call Christendom. And please don't fall for this canard, this stupid idea of Judeo-Christian values. That was a phrase made up by neocons after World War II to try and consolidate this big tent political party, Republican Party big tent thing that was just absolute garbage, where it forced everybody to surrender their values, especially Christians at the end of the day. We live in the world now that's dominated what? By the LGBT community. That is the great virtue of the liberal world that gets us to what? The trans issue. And young people are addicted to porn, but for some reason now feel the need to cut off their breasts and their penises. That is the madness of the West. We've gotten to a point under dictates of liberalism. Again, this post-World War II communist infiltration gets us to where we legalize gay marriage. Never did that happen in the old world, but it happens here, right? The abortion, the contraception, every form of moral depravity, pornography at our fingertips, men sitting at home playing video games and watching porn, deciding not to get married anymore, opting out of that because porn, again, it fulfills that drive, that need that men have. Of course, like I said before, not that there's very many, marriage material women anymore, but porn is there to kind of assist with that problem as well, too, creating another problem with men, right? Men that are not motivated, men that are sitting around playing video games all the time. It's a part of the total degeneration of the West post-World War II, with guess what? With America as the leader. America as the leader of this world order, this liberal world order after World War II, because America became the great superpower of the world, only to be infiltrated by communism and eventually colluding with communism at the same time. This is not to mention the corruption of governments and how we continue to lose freedom. There's no privacy anymore. We're shooting toward, again, an economic system or financial system where they could trace every transaction. They could follow us everywhere we want. They could tell us what we buy. We got social credit scores coming up. I mean, guys, what haven't we lost? What real freedom haven't we lost since the end of World War II? And again, I'll go back to the very start of this cast. What did we win after World War II? What was the great victory? Is liberalism what? Was liberalism the great victor? Even though it destroyed our society, it destroyed our culture, it destroyed our faith. Isn't it interesting that while after the good guy supposedly won World War II, this grand apostasy starts? How is it that the Anglo-Protestants in America and in Britain that collude with the communists, win World War II, and then immediately after World War II, the grand apostasy, the destruction of Christianity begins. Because that's what we've seen. We've seen the Christian world order collapse. We call that Christendom at one time, where families were well ordered, governments were better off, they were more just. Yes, we didn't have democracy. I get that. I know we cherish that in the West. But what has democracy proven? What has democracy proven? Democracy just really, it fulfills everything that liberalism ever wanted, and it justifies it. It gives it sort of a sacramental nature, because the moment something is voted, look at the issue with gay marriage, something that historically has been an abomination throughout all of really every civilization, not just the West, right? The moment it's enshrined by government, there's no stigma against it. Liberalism gives it the justifiable order and legitimacy that it needs to such a degree that nobody even challenges anyone. We just forget about it. Let's move on, fight the next fight until we surrender on something else. Liberalism is an alternative religion that replaced Christianity. And how has that worked out? It's all collapsed at this point in history. Again, guys, what did we win? Many people will tell you, oh, yeah, we won World War II, but it sure doesn't feel like it. Sure doesn't feel like we won. No. Our families are broken. The faith is gone. The culture is rotten. We've been made slaves in this usury economy system. Okay? Tell me what has gone right since the end of World War II. Listen, this is not to exonerate the Nazis. I'm not a fan of the Nazis any kind of way. But it was the communists that promised us or proclaimed a worldwide revolution. And they won. And they conquered the world. And the Protestant liberal republics, like the damn fools they are, they bought it. They were suckered into it. And most people in the West still don't want to acknowledge this great mistake historically. Guys, there you have it. The West has fallen. It is gone thanks to the liberal world order created by the end result of World War II. I hate to be a pessimist, but that's how I see it. If you guys think I'm wrong, please let me know in the comment section. I'm more than open to being corrected. I am. That's it, guys. This is Frank. Signing off. Frank is speaking. Good night, everybody.